Members of the Council, guests, and friends, it's my pleasure on behalf of our Board of Trustees to welcome you this evening. I'd like to thank the Northrop Grumman Electronic Sensors and Systems Group for sponsoring the reception for this evening's program. Our next guest, a couple weeks hence, is Clovis Maqsood. A lot of you will have heard Mr. Maqsood on one or two of his previous two engagements with the Council. He used to be the Arab League representative to the United States and the United Nations, and he now is at American University as a professor and head of their Center for the South. As you probably know, he's a very, very shrewd observer, very articulate, and always provides an enjoyable evening. Introducing our guest this evening is a member of the Board of the Council who served at the United States as ambassador to Luxembourg and then later as ambassador to the Netherlands, Kingdon Gould.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I bring the apologies of His Excellency Ambassador Kroborg, who was unable to be here this evening for a very particular reason. He was asked by Chancellor Schröder to go to Arizona to plead for the clemency of two German nationals who faced the execution. And that appeal is being made even as we meet here. We are very fortunate to have an excellent replacement for Ambassador Kroborg in Mr. Matussek, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the German Embassy and has been for some time in Washington. Thomas Matussek was born in 1947. He served in the German Army. He's a reserve lieutenant. He entered the Foreign Service after studying in the university in Bonn and in Paris. And he served in London in the office of Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. Later he went to New Delhi, to London, to Lisbon, and then served as chef du cabinet for two different foreign ministers, Foreign Minister Genscher and Foreign Minister Kinkel. It's, I can tell you from my own experience, there is nothing as valuable as a wonderful Deputy Chief of Mission, and he has been the Deputy Chief of Mission for 4 years now in Washington. He's married, he has two daughters and a son. They live in Washington. We're sorry they're not here with us this evening. We look forward to meeting them on a social occasion later on. It's a lot of pleasure that I welcome to you the gentleman who will speak about the complexities which face Germany today. The unification, reunification of Germany, it seems to me, is a kind of work in progress. There are many difficulties that are left over from the communist regime, among them the kind of fictitious economy that existed, which when returned to a market economy resulted in unemployment in what was Eastern Germany because there was a lack of efficiency in the businesses that were there. So there was very high unemployment in what was Eastern Germany. Also, unfortunately, the communist regimes were very cavalier with regard to the environment, and there are terrible environmental problems that affect much of East Germany and other areas where there was high industrialization under communist regimes. Now, all of this will be explained to you by Mr. Matussek, who will also talk about the new regime under Chancellor Schröder, who himself has received a recent setback in the state of Hesse, where his party was somewhat emaciated in a recent election. So it's a very complicated Germany today. Germany, the largest, most powerful country in Europe, most reliable ally, presently has the presidency of the European Union. Without further words, I'm happy to turn the podium over to Thomas Matussek.
Ambassador Gould, Governor Schaefer, Dr. Burd, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all tell all of you who are disappointed that I'm not the ambassador, I share your disappointment. But I can promise you I'll work very, very hard in the coming years to remedy that unfortunate situation. No, seriously, I'm delighted to be here today as a guest speaker of the venerable Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. And the beautiful setting for this lecture, this spectacular view from the World Trade Center overlooking the inner harbor of Baltimore, invite one to leave behind the daily grind of politics and diplomacy and to step back and to try to put things into perspective. One of the great orators of the 20th century, the immortal British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, declared that the three most difficult things in the world are: 1, to climb a ladder leaning towards you; 2, to kiss a girl leaning away from you; and 3, to make an after-dinner speech. With this in mind, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for having placed my speech before dinner. It makes the task a lot easier, and probably even more so on you, unless you're really hungry. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to speak in two capacities at once: as German Deputy Chief of Mission, and at the same time as the representative of the EU presidency, which, as you know, Germany holds for 6 months on a rotating basis. That does not, however, mean, as you will quickly realize, that I'm divided in my loyalties when I speak. I'm speaking in one clear language, and that is English. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany has had a new government for close to 4 months now. In principle, a new currency for not quite 2 months. And in the course of this year, Germany will move its seat of government and parliament to a new and at the same time old capital city, Berlin. That is quite a lot of change for one country which over the years is said to have developed a strong inclination for constancy, and often with a negative undertone, a reluctance to change. But let me reassure you, the Germans won't change everything. They won't give up their love for precision engineering cars, for orderliness, punctuality, or even the Munich Oktoberfest. The new German government consists of a coalition that is unprecedented in Germany, and you could say fresh. In this coalition, Germany's oldest party, the Social Democratic Party, or SPD, whose roots trace back to the workers' movement of the 19th century, has joined together with one of Germany's newest parties, which grew out of the environmental movement of the 70s and 80s, the Alliance 90, the Greens. And thus from the start, that makes labor and the environment two dominant government issues. With the change in government, a generational shift has also occurred. To me, this is an extremely important point. The new government embodies a new political generation that does not have any first-hand memories of the war. Rather, it grew up in a democratic Germany that quite naturally perceived itself as part of Europe and in close alliance with the United States as a part of the free Western world. From the German viewpoint, being European has never been as self-evident and easy as it is today. But let me return to politics in a narrower sense. In the meantime, the new German government has had time and opportunity to prove its credentials. It is clear that fighting unemployment will be a top priority. Now, during these winter months in Germany, again, over 4 million people are out of work. The new government is committed to mobilizing all the forces in society into a so-called Alliance for Jobs, a forum in which labor, management, and government will agree on concrete measures to fight unemployment. The government wants to guarantee social justice through comprehensive tax reform. It also wants to reward environmentally sound behavior and spur the domestic economy. In the field of citizenship, the government still aims to make it easier for foreign residents to acquire a German passport. Some of these foreign residents have been living in Germany for generations. As concerns foreign policy, the key word is continuity. That applies to the central importance of Germany's relations with the United States, as well as to its firm anchoring in the Atlantic Alliance. The government will also devote special attention to promoting human rights worldwide and strengthening the United Nations. In specific crisis areas of the recent past, Kosovo and Iraq, the government has made clear how much it is committed to the continuities of German foreign policy. The Rambouillet talks, as we know since this afternoon, have not fully succeeded. As a matter of fact, the only agreement is to reconvene on March 15th. But once that happens, Germany is prepared to contribute roughly as many troops to a NATO-led Kosovo force as is the United States. To be quite precise, 2,000 more troops than the United States. In terms of our policy towards the European Union, continuity is again the catchword. Germany holds currently the presidency for 6 months, but before going into detail here, I would like to stress Germany's foremost goal during this period, and that is to prepare the European Union's structures and procedures so that it can evolve from a Western European Union into a union for the whole of Europe, capable of global action. This understood, allow me to make 4 points on the German EU presidency. First, the launch of the euro on January 1st, also the first day of the German presidency, has ushered in a new era for Europe. From Lisbon to Paris, from Rome to Helsinki, 290 million people will share a single currency in the future. Cashless bank and stock exchange transactions are already now being conducted only in euros. Notes and coins, which will replace the old pesetas, Gulden, Deutschmarks, will come in good 3 years. The single currency will make Europe more competitive and attractive as a place to do business. American business people have long realized the advantages the euro has to offer. They no longer have to fear exchange rate fluctuations within Europe. If they are active in several European countries at once, for instance in Ireland, Spain, Italy, they will be able to service their European suppliers as well as pay their employees from a single account, say in Frankfurt or in Paris, thereby streamlining their business and saving a lot of money. The euro is Europe's answer to globalization. As a reserve currency, the euro will assume responsibility, along with the dollar, for stability on the global financial markets. A certain degree of competition with the dollar can only be healthy, and it will benefit the global economy in terms of performance and stability. The euro will lead the Europeans to more uniformity in fiscal and economic policy, tax and labor market policy, and prove to be an enormous catalyst of European integration in political terms. Finally, the euro will develop into a symbol of European identity, which will instill a greater sense of solidarity in the people of the old continent wherever they go. Second point, the next historic challenge for the EU is already following on the heels of the euro. It is EU enlargement. EU enlargement will integrate the formerly communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe into one whole Europe, into a zone of prosperity and stability. Especially in Germany, we have not forgotten the invaluable contribution the people of Central and Eastern Europe had made toward ending the division of Germany and Europe. Now, the geography of the Cold War will finally be overcome. This unshakable goal is, by the way, also in the American interest, because the European Union, like NATO, exports political stability. Of course, I know the devil is in the details, because the European Union is more than a customs union. Its common legal framework, which is binding for all member states, affects agricultural policy as much as it does environmental protection, competition law as much as it does consumer protection, and many other things. The new acceding members will have to adopt over 20,000 legal provisions, the so-called acquis communautaire, and this adjustment alone needs time. It will also cost a great deal of money. Experts have figured out that alone implementation of the European Potable Water Directive by a single accession, a candidate such as Poland, will cost 22 billion euros, that's more than $25 billion. Nevertheless, the prospect remains that after the turn of the millennium, which as we know will happen very shortly, the European Union will consist of not 15, but over 24 member states with almost 500 million inhabitants. Third point, to equip itself for such sweeping enlargement, the European Union must reform its own internal structures, which were originally conceived for just 6 member states. It must restructure its finances, establish more fairness in the EU contribution payment system, make its costly agricultural policy more competitive, and rethink its political decision-making structures. Only thus can we make our institutions fit for the future. The key question here is whether the European Union is ready to accept majority decisions in as many areas as possible. The new German government advocates limiting the need for unanimous votes to questions of fundamental importance, such as, for instance, treaty amendments. Fourth point, we want to make significant progress in developing an effective employment policy. Unemployment is the greatest worry of the European people. They quite rightly expect not just national governments, but also European institutions to take action against unemployment. That is why we want to conclude a European Employment Pact at the Cologne European Council meeting in June. The pact should reflect an active labor market policy which focuses more on prevention, that is, on reducing youth and long-term unemployment and discrimination against women in the job market. Ladies and gentlemen, at the national level, the Employment Pact might also give an additional boost to solving persistent problems in Germany's eastern states, formerly known as the GDR, where unemployment is still unacceptably high, at the moment 18.9%. Rebuilding the Eastern German economy is a national task, requiring the solidarity of everyone in both the East and the West. And as you will probably know, enormous sums to the order of $80 to $100 billion per year have flowed into the new states since reunification in 1990. Overall, a sum of about $1 trillion so far. If it hadn't been for these transfer payments, Germany would have been running a budget surplus long ago. Instead, the initial financial burden has placed an enormous strain on the German taxpayer. However, these efforts have paid off, resulting in the most modern infrastructure in Europe. Nevertheless, it will take some time until Germany is fully united, economically, and perhaps even more important, psychologically. We are on the right tracks towards inner unity. Only the road is much longer and has more curves and potholes than we expected back in 1989. Ladies and gentlemen, this year, the German government is facing yet another formidable challenge: the move to Berlin, the new and old capital city of Germany, and this is a momentous undertaking for my country. 10,000 civil servants, plus their families, along with the employees of countless associations, lobby organizations, businesses, and their families, will soon pick up and move to Berlin. They will all have to create a new home for themselves in the new capital city. Berlin seems to me to be well prepared for the deluge, not just with respect to the many apartments and homes which have been built or renovated. To me, one of the most fascinating things about Berlin since the wall came down is that the heart of this 750-year-old European metropolis is beating again. The center of the new Berlin is re-emerging exactly on the same spot near Potsdamer and Pariser Platz, where 10 years ago the Berlin Wall and barbed wire formed a seemingly insurmountable division between East and West in the midst of a wasteland. The development of this site is probably among the greatest architectural feats of the century. The architects selected to build the new Berlin are a very international lot. This also reflects the spirit of present-day Germany. The Japanese architect Pei is creating edifices on Friedrichstraße and Potsdamer Platz. Sir Norman Foster of the United Kingdom is redesigning the former Reichstag, and the Polish-born American Daniel Liebeskind has built the Jewish Museum. So if you have the chance, I would urge you all to go and see the Berlin in the making. It's worth the trip. From a political perspective, the government's move to Berlin also represents an important contribution to German unity. Geographically, it will create a new balance between the old and the new states and encourage people to become reacquainted with each other. Berlin, with its magnetic attraction radiating in all directions, will come to crystallize the integration of Eastern and Western Germany. and it will be the center of what is already now called the Berlin Republic. For some, the word Berlin still holds negative connotations of old Prussia, of authoritarianism, centralism. Some also see it predominantly linked to Adolf Hitler. But let's be fair to Berlin. Since the close of the 18th century, Berlin has enjoyed a reputation of a city of the arts and sciences. Athens on the river Spree, it's been called. In the 1920s, Berlin was considered perhaps the most dazzling center of the cultural avant-garde, and during the Cold War, the city won world renown as a beacon of freedom. And remember, it was the Americans who came to defend Berlin's freedom. President Kennedy won the hearts of all Berliners when he spoke the words, "I take pride in saying, ich bin ein Berliner." If there ever was a German town of American making, it certainly is Berlin. In moving their government to Berlin, the German people are showing faith in themselves, in the certainty that they remain committed to the same democratic spirit and constitution that they embraced a half-century ago in Bonn. And that is as it should be. The Berlin Republic will be a civil, cosmopolitan country blending smoothly and cooperatively into the family of nations. Ladies and gentlemen, now that I've taken you on a brief excursion to Berlin, let me return to Europe and America. Traditionally, the German DCM to the United States does not deliver a speech on fundamental political issues without underscoring the vital importance of transatlantic relations. This has been the case for nearly half a century, and I assure you, even at the risk of boring you, this policy is not going to change. Transatlantic relations are and will remain a pillar of European and German foreign policy. In the past few years, we have created a wide array of new instruments aimed at intensifying our partnership, such as the new transatlantic agenda and the transatlantic business dialogue. And that is a good thing. In April, here in Washington, we will jointly reflect on our future cooperation within NATO, which will remain the guarantor of European security. Since the end of the East-West conflict, trade issues have increasingly moved to the forefront of US-European relations. Our trade relations are extremely developed, solid, and balanced. In imports and exports, bilateral trade accounts for approximately 20% of the overall trade volume on each side of the Atlantic. Our investment figures are even higher. EU companies account for well over 50% of all direct foreign investment in the US. The Transatlantic Economic Partnership, which was agreed upon at the EU-US Summit in London last May, will provide impetus for greater trade through further reduction in trade barriers. It goes without saying, however, that in trade issues, we are not only partners, but we are also competitors. And of course, we have to be careful not to let individual disputes get the better of us and ruin the good climate in our relations. We Europeans don't want to slip on any banana peels or choke on American hormone-enhanced beef. These kinds of problems are normal in every close relationship and should not set us off on a rage. We have the tools, like the WTO, for example, to solve these problems. The Europeans are also, by the way, growing less willing to accept it when the United States, out of its own justified interest, tries to unilaterally set global rules of appropriate economic conduct, as in the case of the Helms-Burton sanctions against Cuba. It is politically imperative that the Europeans and Americans find their way to ever closer, equal cooperation, and that the Americans include and consult the Europeans in all important decisions that affect them. The American tendency, especially that of parts of Congress, to concentrate very heavily on domestic issues runs counter to this aim, as does unilateralism in foreign policy. Only together, in European-American solidarity, can we tackle the major political and economic challenges of our day, whether in Russia or Southeast Asia. We must look for responses to the new global security risks which, after the East-West conflict, now occupy our attention more than ever before. Narcotics trafficking, organized crime, terrorism, as well as climate change and environmental destruction. But this only makes sense if we do it together. The European-American Security Partnership, which permanently rests on common values and interests, is 50 years old, and thus, as we say in German, in its prime. That should certainly count for something. With this security partnership as our backbone, ladies and gentlemen, we can look to the next millennium with optimism. And not even Y2K problems need scare us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is now open to question. Mr. Roper, would you comment about the American troop presence in Germany and how well it's working?
As you know and as you said, practically all Americans who were stationed in Germany, and that if you include the family members, were about 17 million Americans, practically all of them had a pretty good time in Germany and were very well liked. Now, it's quite obviously that this presence has been drastically reduced. And of course, this was painful. Painful for us because in many parts of Germany, the American forces were a major employer. So if you close down a garrison, it affects the local business. And of course, the decision, do we close this airbase or that airbase, was a highly political issue. And the present German defense minister, Rudolf Scharping, in his capacity as the governor or prime minister of Rheinland-Pfalz, came to Washington every couple of months to plead with the Americans rather to close down bases in the next country. So this is quite frankly, this is a grave problem. But this is a reality of the post-Cold War years, which we cannot avoid. Other problems I cannot see. It's that the Germans hate to see Americans leave their country, and what we want instead is attract other Americans, attract, for instance, business, attract young people, attract students. Because, you see, these 17 million Americans, they're acted like the best ambassadors on both sides, and they really formed a very, very solid transatlantic bridge. And we have to be very, very careful that once this bridge is gone, we replace it with another bridge. Not because it just gives you a nice and fuzzy and cozy feeling, but we have to make sure that on both sides of the Atlantic, we have a feeling how the other partner ticks. If and when we are surprised by legislation in Congress, which was introduced for purely domestic reasons, we ever so often find that the people who introduced it, when we explain to them how it affects us, they said, well, we didn't think of it, didn't know. So for that reason, for instance, it's very, very important that the elites or the youth on both sides of the Atlantic stay in close personal touch. And it starts from such, simple down-to-earth issues. For instance, visa costs for foreign students if they want to study here at the American universities and vice versa. This is the concrete fields where we have to work upon much more than in the past.
Yes, sir. The question is, how welcome are American professors in German universities? For a tenured position as a permanent member of the faculty.
They are very, very welcome. Very, very welcome. The problem only is that the normal German university cannot offer the same working conditions that an American university does, for a number of reasons. First of all, as far as the salary is concerned, German universities are state university. The salaries normally paid there are not very high. Second thing is, you have under our university constitution the so-called co-determination. That means every single decision is not being made just by the faculty, is being made by a body which consists to 1/3 of the professors, 1/3 of the assistants, and 1/3 of all the other employees. And this, for instance, is not, yes, and I tell you, this is why, and I say this quite openly because it's no good to hide things, this led to a certain brain drain of excellent German professors to British or American universities. We would love to reverse this trend, and university reform is already underway, because the last university reform we had was in 1968 and the year following 68 for obvious reasons. And with throwing overboard old authoritarian professorial regimes, things really went too far in the other directions. And now, if as a professor, people who don't understand anything of the subject co-decide on what issues you should read, for instance, a theologian, if you are told on which saint to read, then this is the end of academic freedom. So there are reforms underway, and I hope that we be able to speed them up to attract more scholarly excellence from abroad.
Would you elaborate on the specific policies to deal with unemployment?
It has to be a mix of policies, and it is a mix of policies, starting with taxation. Taxation should be lowered for employees and for the firms to encourage them to invest more. Second thing is, education has to be improved, and not just academic education, but much more the vocational training, for which traditionally the Germans were rightly very well known and liked in the world. Thirdly, encouragement to young enterprises by availability of venture capital, for instance. Lots of means to reduce the high labor-related costs. One of the problems why we are not as competitive in the world as should be is the high labor cost, and not just the pay which you carry home, but our social and security and pension additions which the employer has to pay, and that is under review as well. So a whole mix of measures which of course are painful to this or that group. And the reason why it wasn't tackled earlier was quite simply that the old government, the Kohl government, had to rule against the majority in the upper house. So these two democratic constitutional institutions were blocking each other out for years. Now the present government does not have that excuse. But of course, they have a little bit of an excuse, because since the Hesse election, again, it's a 50-50 situation in the upper house, but not as big as under the previous government. And they also have to do with their pressure groups. Trade union movement, for instance, is traditionally very strong in the SPD party. So they have to find a deal in this round table concept, which I just expressed, to get the labor unions to lower their expectations as far as salary increases are concerned. The Greens have their clientele. If they force big business, for instance, to get out on a very short time scale of nuclear energy and instead invest much more in traditional energies, it's costly. And the German international competitiveness is one of the main keys to fight unemployment.
Yes, ma'am. Would you comment on government assistance to the unemployed?
There is government assistance to the unemployed, and until quite recently, the government assistance to the unemployed was so high that it was about the same level as your last salary. So when you were unemployed for the next 3 years, you got 75% of net of your after taxes of your income. So for many people, it was not a high incentive to look for another job. The second thing was that if you were out of a certain job, let's say you were working in the textile business, and the textile industry shifted within the European Union from Germany to Portugal and Spain, you were not forced to take up a job in another line of work. You could say, I'm sitting here in Bielefeld, all the textile factories have closed down. You can't offer me a textile job in Bielefeld, fine. So for the next couple of years, I just keep on getting 75%, and that has been slightly changed, and it will have to be changed more, because in the end, we cannot finance the system, especially as we undergo the same demographic change as in this country. The life expectancy is very high, and from the year 2005 onwards, I think two working persons have to pay for one retired person, and that becomes very, very costly. Yeah, we hope to change that, by the way.
Ambassador Glassman, why doesn't the German government offer citizenship to foreign nationals who have been in Germany for a very long time, including generations?
Traditionally, as you pointed out, we had the jus sanguinis, the law of the blood, instead of the jus soli, which the Anglo-Saxon countries had. You know, for many years, we've had a couple of million strong foreign population who did not want to become Germans because it would automatically mean that they would lose their own nationalities because we were not recognizing dual nationality. That was mostly due to the fact that in the case of the Turkish population, which is the largest slice of the foreign population, that you would lose your right to inherit in Turkey. So you had people there who didn't speak a word of Turkish, who lived there for 3 generations, but did not send their sons to the armies, could not vote in elections, could not be elected, and it was quite clear this had to be changed. So the new German government, the first thing they did is change that law, introduce a new law, whereas you can have dual nationalities if you want so, dual passports, etc. It has not gone through parliament, it is in the parliamentary process. And then came the election of Hesse. The election of Hesse 2-3 weeks ago, when they were analyzed after the elections, people realized that this issue was the main issue why the ruling coalition in Hesse, which consists of the same parties who rule in Bonn, was so severely defeated, because it was highly, highly unpopular. So what we have to do is, like we had to do on the euro and on other issues, the political class, the government, has to take the leadership. It has to explain to the Germans why it is also in their interest to change these laws. And apparently, so far, they have not done a very, very good job. I draw the parallel to the euro. Wherever you asked in Germany in the last couple of years, politicians, business people, bankers, everybody said euro is a great idea. In all the opinion polls, the majority of the German people was dead against it. And only very slowly, they did not like the idea, but they learned to accept it, like bad weather or like the cold. Now, I draw this parallel here because I feel when you elect a government, It's not just there to do exactly what the general sentiment in the local bars and pubs is, but to explain to them what in the long run is better. And this is what the government has to do, has to try to do, because in the long run, look at the violent demonstrations we had after the Öcalan capture. If you have foreign wars fought out between Kurds and Turks on German soil, it's a very bad thing. But if you integrate them, you know, generation after generation, they don't feel like Kurds or Turks, they are Germans with a Turkish passport. And you're absolutely right. Why haven't they done it earlier? I don't know. They woke up pretty late in the day, and I hope they are not discouraged by the Hesse election, because this is easy fodder for the demagogues, which you have in all countries. You know, people on the far right of the spectrum, and in Germany, believe me, as the election show, it's only a minuscule percentage. They say, well, unemployment, it's very clear where it comes from, because the Turks all take the jobs. You know, and this is just not the case, but it has to be explained properly.
Yes, ma'am. What language or languages will be used in EU?
Well, I mean, you have the official languages, but that's not what you mean. In practice, it's English. It's English. I mean, it's not just the EU, but all over the world, it's English. You know, the first times I went to Moscow and I went to Eastern Europe, it was quite clear the second language after Russian and the local language was German. And now it's English. Where you go to Moscow or Prague, the young people speak English. And of course, in France, it is not English. And in Brussels, if you in Brussels, if you work within the European machinery, they have to be very careful to balance it, English and French. But it's a question of globalization. In Germany, if you go to Germany, and more so also in East Germany, and ask for the way in the street in English, you will find people understand you and give you, hopefully, the right direction.
Yes, sir. Should you, do you feel the need to reduce tariff barriers between the United States and Europe, especially, and Germany, especially in agriculture?
Absolutely, and this is what we are working on in the Uruguay round, in the WTO, in the framework of the new Atlantic Economic Partnership. But as you know, and you mentioned agriculture, agriculture is a business, be it here in the States or in Europe, everywhere, which normally is subsidized by one way or the other by the system, by the government, because it provides food for the country, for the people. So in order to remove these protective barriers, you have to agree on a set of rules, how you do it and where you do it. And I mentioned hormone beef. I could also mention the gene-manipulated seeds and so on. This is a very, very severe problem. And as we speak, the conference in Cartagena, I think, ends, and hopefully with a protocol on biosafety, which also is another step in that direction. But definitely, we have to work on both sides of the Atlantic, and work is going on for a couple of years now to reduce the barriers and to reduce subsidies and come to some sort of system which fairly and equally applies the same set of rules.
Yes, sir. Is there a problem in excluding Russia from the EU, specifically the dangers of isolating Russia and consequent frictions?
I don't think there is a danger. First of all, Russia does not want to become a member of the European Union. They made that very, very clear. They don't. Second thing is, you know, you can look at a glass of water, is it half empty or half full? Nobody wants to exclude Russia, but we don't want to include it either. And there are a number of cooperation agreements which we have with Russia on a great number of fields. If we, the European Union, let's say we're double the size or 3 times the size we have, the question would pose itself differently. But Russia is a great European, partly Asian, but mainly European country, which has in Europe a very historic and traditional role, and we want to have friendly relations with Russia. And I think the Russians, if you look back since the days of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union broke apart, If you look, for instance, at the assistance the European Union, and especially Germany, has given to Russia, I think nobody can doubt our seriousness and our willingness to work very closely with Russia. Because if things go wrong in Russia, I think it affects us much more directly than it affects you. So it's not for altruistic reasons, but we have a very, very vested interest to see that Russia stays on the right track, or perhaps should I say, comes back economically on the right track.
Mrs. Sharp, will European countries who want to retain their own currencies perhaps be forced to join the Euro group out of necessity?
Of course, it's for the democratic institution of those countries to make that decision. But if I read Tony Blair right, especially his paper of yesterday, and the general feeling in the banking circles in Great Britain, I would, if I should make a prediction, I would predict that they sooner or later will join the euro. But what I said about political leadership in convincing your people of the right thing to do, the same applies for Britain. You know that, for instance, the Conservative Party in Great Britain is dead set against anything European, any form of integration. And so Tony Blair has quite a job on his hands to persuade them why it's good for the city of London not to play second fiddle to Frankfurt in the long run, but rather join them if you can't beat them. And I think if I look at the majority he has in the British Parliament, I think if there is anyone who could pull it off, it's Tony Blair and his government.
Yes, ma'am. The question is, would you comment on the status of women in Germany?
Yeah. No. I tell you, it's a very, very serious question. If you look at the coalition agreement, the coalition paper of the two new governing parties in Germany, the role of women in the labor market and in society in general is one of the key points. For instance, start with an example. In the public service in Germany, there will be introduced, and is already completely introduced, a so-called women quota. So if various people who are very qualified for one job apply, and if there is a woman among the applicants, you have to take the woman, and you have to even, in some of the green institutions, even they complain they don't have many women. They have to keep slots open because there are only men around. So they're trying to change that back from the women quota into a men quota. But this is a very taken very seriously by the new government. Because why do we have the quota? Because the new government feels that women are still underrepresented in the public sector and also in the private sector. And I don't know all the details about discrimination laws in the private sector, but in the public sector, where the government has direct influence, I think this is one of the key elements of the policy.
Yes, sir. The question is twofold. Why is the euro declining relative to the dollar? And will this have create a problem in the future?
Well, the euro has been declining for the last 2 weeks, so this is not the end of the story. I think the euro was even very strong before there was a euro. Because if you remember the effects of the Asian crisis on the international currencies, all of a sudden you could see that the dollar was more affected than, for instance, the Deutschmark. Not because the Deutschmark is so strong, but people anticipated the euro in the coming. Why the decline in the last 2 weeks? I will tell you. Because first of all, we are faced with an unemployment problem, and the last figures which came out, especially in Germany, were quite frightening. And the other thing is, it was not very helpful that a number of politicians, and I must say also German politicians, put into question the, I have to be careful how to phrase it. Is the television still on? Okay. Put into question the independence, the total independence of the European Central Bank. And that scares the international money market. But I think this is a passing phenomenon. Many people who predict this, I can't predict it, but I think Goldman Sachs made a prediction that at the end of this year, the euro will be much stronger, about $1.20 for the euro than it was at its inception, which was, I think, 1.17.
Yes, sir. The German view on extending NATO to Eastern Europe.
Yes. First of all, you will remember that it basically was a German idea to extend NATO at all by the first three members, and that we had a pretty hard time to persuade the American administration that it's a good idea, because the original understanding was that we should have partnership for peace as a sort of substitute. And we felt you cannot shut the door in the face of the people who, by their own free will, had these peaceful revolutions, wanted to join the West because they believe in the values of the West, and say, sorry, folks, we can't have you. This is the fundamental thing. The other question is, how fast is the pace? How much time does the alliance need first to digest the first three members before we move on to the second group? And if you want the German position, we would like this to be a continuous process. We would like to see a language in the Washington NATO summit which keeps the door open. We would not like so much to name certain names, because if you name one country, you automatically exclude the others. But we would like to give them, as we call it, Madrid Plus. That is, not just repeat that you're all invited, but make clear, without naming the country, what you have to do and what has been done by certain countries and how close they are to entry. But for instance, if you now name the Baltics, then you get reactions, why not Slovenia, Romania, Macedonia? And I think we should learn from the mistakes. I think there were mistakes which some of our friends made before Madrid, come out with certain names, and you had a public haggle about who is in, who is out, which did not benefit the countries involved. Rather go about it, talk about abstract benchmarks. To what degree is are your armed forces under democratic leadership?
This has been an extraordinarily helpful evening for us, very informative, and we thank you for this splendid overview and for giving so much time to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.